Welcome back, my dear friends and foes. I am back with some more Warhammer 40k. I have no idea why I did that. I want to go back to the last Warhammer video where I said this. He uttered a final command, ordering the traitors to be driven into the Eye of Terror. Terror, whatever the flying that may be. I looked it up and was met with another wall of text. No, not today. So yeah, I want to know what this Eye of Terror stuff is all about. I'm going to dive into the Eye of Terror and I'm taking you with me. So grab a chair, grab some coffee, put a thumb up your at least still over the knuckle, otherwise it doesn't count, and we're good to go. So yeah, without further ado, the first description I came across when looking into this was: the Eye of Terror is a realm of madness and despair, where skies weep blood, ancient stars burn in multicolored flares, and the whims of the dark gods of chaos hold sway, synonymous with discord, terror, ancient secrets, and insanity. No other place in the galaxy fills the mind with such dread and foreboding. Well, in the Netherlands we have an exact place like that, but we just call it Urk. But nobody cares, so let's move on. Now, the Eye of Terror, also known as Ocularis Terribus in High Gothic, is the largest and most well-known warp rift and warp storm in the 40k universe. So far, I guess. No. We'll do that another time. Well, what is a warp rift, you might think? Well, a warp rift is a tear in the fabric of the material universe which allows the immaterium, aka the warp, to flow over into the material universe. Well, what is a warp storm? Well, a warp storm is when by disturbances a segment of the warp turns into a violent storm. And these storms can be so violent that they can cause warp rifts in themselves, which can close off entire chunks of the galaxy. Sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, and sometimes even for centuries. Well, the Eye of Terror is both of these things on nuclear steroids. It's a permanent warp rift and a permanent warp storm in one, and it's like 20,000 light years big from end to end. And since it's the biggest presence of the warp in the real galaxy, it's also the place where the biggest concentrations of the forces of chaos reside. Which begs the question, why the hell would you chase the traitors of the Horus heresy off into these parts where they probably are the strongest and can regroup the easiest with their Chaos God homeboys? But hey, I'm not a disabled 10 million IQ Andy, so I'm not gonna doubt my man's strategies here. But if you have some answers for me, let me know in the comments, because I'm a bit lost on this one. Let's move on. But how did this giant satanic booty hole came to be in the first place? Well, it all started with the fall of the Eldar. I'm sorry, about 11,000 years before the current events. And I'm not going to go too deep into all of this in this video, but long story short, the space elves were getting so caught up in sucking Jagons and furry prawn that their insatiable libido started to clog together in the warp as a lewd Majin Buu, which we now all know as Slaanesh. And it was this, the birth of Slaanesh, that came with such a huge psychic. You're a very psychic man. Came with such a huge psychic shock that it spilled over into the material universe through the filthy little minds of our Eldar friends on their original Empire homeworld. So the area that is now known as the Eye of Terror used to be the long-lost Eldar Empire. But it's not just as if this area of space is now infected by the warp. Well, it kinda is, but also it isn't. It's a bit confusing, like everything is in Warhammer. And I don't know if I understand this correctly, but it's more as if this area exists in both realms at the same time. You see, it has a physical place in the material universe, but the laws of physics don't always actually apply there. Time doesn't mean anything anymore, and matter, minds, and energy are all clumping together to the point that there's no longer any actual distinction between them. Although all this is kind of dependent on which demons and which chaos gods hold their influence on the specific planet we're talking about. And talking about these planets, these planets are kind of wacky, which might be an understatement. For example, there is a former Elder homeworld where the inhabitants that couldn't escape this psychic burst got fused to the very planet they used to live on. So now the soil, walls, basically everything is covered in their bones and the haunted faces of the previous inhabitants. It sounds like a cozy place. Or a world which is dedicated to corn, which is entirely covered in an ocean of blood. Or a Slanesh planet, which is just a morbidly obese man curled up in a fetal position. Or let's make it even more wackier. There was an instance where two greater demons had some quarrel with each other and built a land bridge between their two worlds and let their followers fight it out. But once they had squashed their own personal beef, they flung the worlds and their inhabitants with their followers into the void to eternally fight each other. Yeah. Or even there was a planet that seems very normal and very nice. And it kinda is. Except they take prisoners from outside the Eye of Terror and use their souls to make delicious drinks. What? But yeah, enough about the planets. Let's get back to the actual eye itself. You see, at the center of the Eye of Terror is something that's called the Bissos, or the Bisos, I think it's Bissos, which is basically the butthole from which all this chaos crap gets excreted. It's a literal hole in the fabric of reality through which raw chaos energy seeps into the material universe. And it's all that chaos crap that also makes it basically impossible to navigate through the Eye of Terror without having a direct line to the chaos gods. Hey, Nigel, I'm kinda lost. Can you give me some directions here, pal?
You just take the next left here, and then you go straight for a while. Yeah.
And it's extremely dangerous to even get close to the Eye of Terror, seeing that doing so might at best put you off course, and at worst will get you stuck in space-time limbo for eternity. So navigating the warp is practically impossible because of like the warp storms and such. So even the traitor forces that reside in the Eye, they just fling their ships into the warp, hoping that the ruinous forces will take them to their enemies. I mean, I guess you could call it ruinous roulette. Haha, fuck you. And it's these traitor forces that use the Eye of Terror as their home base, as their refuge, seeing it so incredibly dangerous for the Imperium to venture in to hunt them down. And by living in these conditions, well, even their bodies started to reflect the corruption they were exposed to. For example, the Death Guard, being Nigel's homeboys, eventually starting to get bloated, disease-ridden bodies, and the Slanesh boys growing tits on their face. Bro, I don't know, just roll with it, man. But the Imperium of Men did have some measures against the warp and its inhabitants. Countless worlds just outside its edges on all sides with insane fortifications to be able to quickly respond to the inevitable incursions the forces of chaos would undertake. And the most important world of all was, you guessed it, Disney World. No, wait, Cadia. I'm sorry, I was confused. You see, Cadia was the most fortified of all these worlds, since it had something that were called the Cadian pylons, which were mysterious monoliths that were made by the Necron millions of years ago. Leave it to the ancient space Egyptians to build giant structures that nobody knows a fuck about. What we do know about these pylons is that they were made to fend off the influence of the Immaterium, presumably made during the Necron War versus the Old Ones, in order to keep them from using the warp against them and to cut off the Immaterium from real space altogether. That went well. But in present day, this made for a stable gateway into the Eye of Terror, earning the name the Cadian Gate. Well, eventually it all went to shit. And there's the other thing that crept up on me earlier already, which intertwines with that, but we'll leave that for another day. So yeah, that was my little dive into the Eye of Terror. Thank you guys for joining me once again. Maybe subscribe, maybe? Okay, thanks again, guys. Bye.